The atoll lay like a pale ring set in a field of darker water, its passes softened by a neap tide that moved more by suggestion than by muscle. I brought the survey launch off idle and let the hull settle into a patient tremor, the kind that keeps tools honest without rattling their memory. Routine came first. I checked the multibeam head where it rode under the bow plate, wiped salt from the fairing with the back of a glove, and turned the power path on in the order that always keeps gremlins bored. The deck log waited on its clipboard, paper rippling only a little. I wrote a simple open. Weather fair, swell low, neap regime, intention to run cross-reef lines from lagoon lip to outer slope. No poetry, just the kind of words that keep a day from slipping. We had set a tide staff on the reef-flat at first light, a simple pole with a face I could read from the launch with binoculars when glare behaved. The staff sat steady, as if pleased to be spared the spring fuss. On the stern, I clipped a drogue to a light line and tossed it over, wanting a sense of what the water wanted from us. The drogue turned once and then settled, canvas mouth open, line taut but not insistent. A good sign. Neap water whispers. I could write corrections later without wrestling the math. I eased the throttle and brought us onto the first line, a path I had planned the night before with the chart plotter set to a quiet palette. My tracks from earlier reconnaissance curled there like neat stitches. I kept the swath overlap generous, crossed my fingers for clean returns, and listened for the first pings. The multibeam began to speak in a familiar cadence that is more felt than heard, a heartbeat disguised as work. The plotter painted the fan in calm brushstrokes, each ping a small vote for what lay below. Coral heads, sand tongues, the long slope where reef falls to blue. I kept an eye on the tide staff through glass and wrote a short note to myself to check the height on the half hour. The drogue line hummed a little where it rode the gunnel. Salt touched the lip and tasted like an old coin. Diesel smell hung low, not sharp, just the usual warmth of a machine doing an easy job. The sun rose into a haze that took the glare down a notch. Everything made the quiet promises of a neap day. The first anomaly wore politeness. A slice of the swath went mute near the outer lip where the slope steepened, a clean absence rather than a mess of noise. I have seen mutes like that when air rides the face, or when a beam catches the edge of a thermocline and finds itself confused. I adjusted gain with the lightest touch, nudged roll stabilization, and ran the same ground again, overlapping more than I needed. The gap repeated itself, same shape, same location, like a missing tooth you cannot help probing with the tongue. I logged it with a calm line, small dropout on outer slope, repeating cause unknown, will verify on reciprocal. We turned at the planned limit and came back on the mirror line. The drogue swung, then steadied. Tide staff face stayed friendly. The multibeam returned to clean painting, and I let the happy monotony resume. When we reached the suspect fringe, the mute bite returned. Not larger, not smaller, just sure of itself. I marked the edges on the plotter and saved a screen capture for later, though I trust paper more than pixels when it matters. I jotted a proposed test, different speed, altered ping cadence, a short holdover to see if the water would answer a stare. The second breadcrumb came with a small sound. The ping cadence slipped by a breath, hardly enough to notice unless you love these machines. A late echo is a rare bird in clear water. I leaned closer to the waterfall of returns and watched the tails smear where they should have been crisp. A subtle delay, then normal, then delay again. The pattern did not match swell or wind. It felt timed to nothing I could name. I tapped the housing with 2 knuckles out of habit, which does nothing technical and sometimes helps the human. No change. I kept the speed steady because changing too many things at once makes liars out of notes. I could see a mooring can off my starboard quarter, a faded drum used by research crews to spare the reef the anchor's tooth. The can held still, as if remembering a heavier tide. I set a short experimental loop around it to clear my head. The plotter showed the loop, then shivered, and the track behind me thinned to ghost. It didn't vanish completely. It paled, as if the machine had lost conviction about what we had already done. I blinked, zoomed, and the line recovered its confidence with a quiet snap. I watched my own wake shift in the window of past time and felt a small, cold space open behind the breastbone. I wrote a line I hoped would make sense later. Momentary desaturation of track line on chart plotter. Physical wake present, optical wake distinct. Investigate logging buffer. I returned to the work. I made a new run across the mute region, this time slowing a little and asking the system to tighten its listening. The drogue told me little. The water wanted to rest. The staff read steady. I stood in the shade of the canopy and let my hands do the things they know. I shifted the fan angle by a hair to see if the blind patch would slide. It did not. I took a note about beam footprint versus slope, a thought about grazing angles when coral shelves stack like old ledgers. Then the delayed echoes added a new habit, a double whisper at the end of some traces, like two soft shoes landing at once on a deck that should have felt only one. I didn't write that part yet. Words give things weight they may not deserve. Instead, I added a test to my plan, run a straight northing and then a clean east-west cross to see if the mischief cared about orientation. I lined up the launch on a line I trusted and let the fan play. The watercolor shifted to a greener cast and I smelled something I only catch after rain, mineral and leaf, though there was no river near enough to lend that taste. The delay returned on the green sections and left when the blue took over. I wrote a brief. Smell changed to fresh mineral near dropout zone. Weather steady, no visible plume. Consider lensing from temperature pocket or suspended microbubbles. On the return pass, the plotter offered another small deceit. The base chart under our tracks seemed to breathe, edges of sand tongues drawing in and out a finger's width while the vessel icon held its place. I know software quirks. I also know when a quirk arrives with the same timing as a sound. The double whisper came back at the slope lip, and the chart beneath us flexed like fabric being smoothed by a hand I could not see. I added a careful sentence to the log, avoiding story words. Apparent base layer distortion concurrent with repeat of double tail on beam returns. Timestamp approximate, no change to fix. I let the pen hang a moment, then wrote an ordinary sentence about sea state and glare so the page would not feel like a superstition ledger. By midday, the neap had pressed the lagoon into a long, low quiet. I checked the staff through glass and read the face with the ease of an old friend. Corrections would be gentle. I drank warm water and tasted a trace of metal from the bottle's rim. Heat softened the smell of diesel into something almost sweet. I ran a final pair of lines over the mute bite and then shut the array down in reverse order, letting the heartbeats fade until the boat felt like an animal that had slept and now watched me. Back at the reef-flat, I brought the bow into a pocket of sand and let the anchor kiss once and hold. I took the binoculars to the staff and read again, then waded to the pole for a manual check because sometimes eyes lie. The paint marks met the water where they should have. A small school of black bar fish flicked around my shins and then returned to their errands. The reef smelled bright and clean. I listened for the sea's small talk and heard only that steady hush. I placed a fingertip against the staff to feel for tremor. It felt like bone. Before heading in, I opened the deck log and wrote the day's skeleton on a fresh page. Passes completed, idle anomalies, proposed tests for the morrow, equipment status. I kept it spare and accurate. At the end, I wrote a line I almost deleted. Sections of completed track appeared to lighten and then restore during operation. No file corruption detected. Chart base showed subtle shift under icon while return suggested stable hull. I underlined nothing. I closed the board and set it by the helm like a small, obedient truth. When I powered the plotter down, the screen went black, and in the reflection I saw the reef ring and my own outline with the tide staff standing behind me like a witness. The drogue on the stern thumped once against the hull as if a hand had let it go and then thought better of it. I told myself I was hungry and that the day had been clean work with a little mystery to keep the brain awake. I told myself that the missing tooth in the swath would be a quirk of angle or a pocket of bubbles or a playful ray holding too still. I told myself these things in a voice I use when weather is turning but has not yet admitted it. On the way back through the pass, the fan was quiet, the plotter asleep, and the staff shrinking behind us to a stripe against glare. I kept the launch just off the channel center and watched the water stand in sheets over the coral heads. All restraint, all civility. The engine note held easy. Yet I felt that small, cold space again, the one that opens when rules begin to bend. It was not fear, not yet. It was the awareness that charts are only promises and some places are old enough to edit them. I tied up at the mothership and gave my report with the calm of a technician who trusts procedure. I left out the part where the track line paled and the base breathed. I said I would verify, and I meant it. In my pocket, the pencil had left a gray smear on my fingers. It looked like the kind of mark you get from rubbing out a line on paper until the paper remembers the line anyway. I woke before the mothership's galley stirred and took the launch while the horizon still held some night. The neap lay over the atoll like a hand that meant to soothe. I let the engine idle until its note was a low reassurance, and walked my little checklist with the patience that keeps these jobs from turning to story. Power on in the order that mollifies gremlins, inspection of the multibeam face for salt freckles, connectors seated, fan angle verified, topside software open to the same sober palette as yesterday. I wrote a short line in the deck log about intent, confirm the mute bite on the outer slope, observe any repeated delay in tails, inspect moorings. I added a note on mood, which I rarely do. Crew calm, weather steady, curiosity warranted. On the reef-flat, the tide staff waited exactly where I had left it, paint marks clean at the face. Through the glass, I read a polite, small height that promised light corrections. I dropped the drogue again and felt it take, not vigorous, just a confident hold. The line hummed with a faint suggestion, like a string tuning itself. I said aloud that this was a day for patience and eased the launch toward the pass. The mooring can that had sat so well yesterday seemed a finger's width off its mark, a thing only a fussy eye would call motion. Neap water should not walk a can like that without help. I made a slow circle, took bearings against the headland line and a pair of coral boulders I had fixed in my head. The can slid a little against that homemade cross. Not a drift, a test. The line to its anchor must have relaxed and then thought better of it. I logged. Apparent minor excursion of research mooring relative to static features. Cause unknown. Observe. I brought the swath across the outer lip with the same overlap as before. The multibeam came alive in its working cadence, that felt pulse that encourages a body to breathe in sympathy. The mute bite answered my return with the same missing tooth. I adjusted nothing at first to keep the comparison honest. Then I tried what I had promised myself, a different speed, a hair more listening time, a slight nudge to roll stabilization. The hole held. I marked it again and saved another capture I did not trust as much as paper. The delayed tails began their light mischief just as the lagoon water shaded greener. I tasted a mineral change in the air, the sort of clean that follows a far rain, though the sky above made no such claim. The double whisper tagged a few traces at the outer edge of the fan and then fell quiet as we crossed a sand tongue. I logged that timing and swallowed my opinion. A second sense arrived that was too small to elevate. A faint sweetness under the diesel, not pleasant exactly, more like old kelp turned in whooshing water. I let it pass through me and fixed on process. I set a line that would take me by the mooring can and then continue out to the shelf's shoulder. On approach, the can held its new place, nothing overt, just wrong to the degree that makes a practitioner doubly formal. I called it into the mothership with the language of maintenance and asked for no action. The answer was the voice of a person who trusts a field hand to finish a thought before turning it to a problem. I took that trust and kept moving. At the shelf shoulder, the plotter's base layer performed its little breath again. The icon of my launch stayed sure. The sand tongues under it tugged half a finger this way, then settled. The delayed tails chose that moment to wear their double whisper. I wrote in the margin of the log without stopping the boat, concurrent base flex and trace doubling. No change in sea state, wind small and steady. As I wrote, the graphite left a darker stroke than usual, and a smudge that looked like a finger moved across the page before the hand did. I lifted the pencil and found my thumb clean. Habit says not to court illusions. Habit also says to mark what you see. I turned the sheet a little so any future smear would be plain as a mechanical thing, not an omen. I brought us crosswise to yesterday's pattern to see whether the mute bite cared about orientation. It did not. I tried a short hold in the center of that absence, drifting without engine, letting the drogue take what little tide would give. The drogue line softened, as if the water under us had turned thin, then took an unexpected small pull toward the moat outside the reef. Neap should not breathe like that. I watched the tide staff through glass and saw the face behave as it had. My body felt the faintest tremor up from hull to shoes, not a knock, not a scrape, more like a deck under a man who has shifted his weight to stand. I wrote nothing of that. I told the log instead that the drogue line showed a brief reverse of expected set while on station over mute region. Staff reading steady, plan to repeat. I turned back toward the lagoon to run a check line near a string of private marker buoys locals use to thread the corals. They are always a little irregular, as handmade things are, but they carry their own logic. Today the logic had loosened. A buoy that had worn a frayed flag now sat closer to a coral head than it had the morning before. Another had leaned into its tether as though someone had tied it with a second thought and left the first thought behind. I approached one and killed the engine at a respectful distance. The float turned once in the small chop and then set itself pointing out of the lagoon as if pulled by a tide that belonged to another day. I wrote a calm line. Several private markers exhibiting orientation and spacing changes inconsistent with observed set. Advise contacting owners after verification. When I brought the swath across that field of floats, the double whisper regrouped. It did not touch every return. It selected a few as if choosing partners. I added an experiment to my mind. If I changed only the fan's angle by the smallest step, would the whispers choose new tails or follow the same patch of water? I made the change. The whispers kept allegiance to place, not beam. That made me think of water doing something beneath notice rather than hardware chasing phantoms. I wrote the inference without naming it. Notes are safest when they describe. Near midday, with the sun bleached into the haze and the boat's shadow flattened into a sleepy oval, I put the bow toward the reef-flat to repeat the manual check on the staff. Before I stepped off, the mooring can knocked against its tether in a way that is familiar when a squall line leans hard on the world. The sky argued against that kind of knock. I froze, counted a few breaths not as numbers, but as a quiet handful, and then the can lay down again as if embarrassed to have spoken. I looked for a surface sign and saw none. In the shallows, the staff felt true under my fingers. The paint met the water where it should. The reef smell was bright and clean, as it had been. But at the edge of hearing there was a new motif, a hush that was almost a voice and almost engine bleed, not near or far, just there, repeating with the patience of someone who knows you will look up if it repeats often enough. I tried to give it no story. No. I told myself it was the boat's generator caught in some odd reflection. Back on the launch, the generator read smooth to the ear and to the fingertip on the casing. I watched the plotter while listening. The base layer did its soft flex with the rhythm of that half voice. I told myself that was my mind looking for pattern. I also drew a tiny mark in the log to anchor the moment, because denying a pattern can be as foolish as embracing one too soon. I made a final pass along the inner face of the pass to check on the private buoys again before returning to the mothership. One buoy that had tilted outward now stood almost upright. Its tether wore a fresh scrape, pale against the old fiber, as if it had rubbed coral that morning and then forgiven the coral. I considered lifting it to look for a cut, but left it be. Interfering with another mariner's hardware has a way of tangling neighborly waters. I took a photograph for memory and for any later letter written in apologetic tone. Back aboard the mothership, I gave a report that would not start an unhelpful conversation. I spoke of the mute patch, of delayed tails, of the slight and probably temporary shifts in private markers. I framed it as a request for another day's patient work rather than a problem needing a plan. The answer came with quiet approval. I added to my deck log a proposed suite of tests for morning. Deploy a second drogue in parallel for redundancy, set a portable tide staff on the lagoon side to compare faces, run a long drift with sonar idle to strip variables, schedule a close look at the mooring chain if permitted. I kept the words lean and practical. Later, alone on the launch to tidy cables and make the gear ready, I scrolled through the tracks. In the window that shows the day's path as if it were thread laid on felt, I watched a short reach near the outer lip grow pale again, then return, then pale. I checked the file integrity and the software swore itself clean. I held the edge of the screen to steady my hand and caught my reflection in the reef ring behind me as if we were all printed on thin film. The drogue bumped the hull with a small apologetic thud. I reached for the light switch and paused, listening for the half voice. It had gone quiet. The sea had returned to its manners. I closed the log and slid it into the helm tray. The graphite smudge that had puzzled me earlier had faded into the page as if the paper had drawn it down and kept the memory to itself. I told myself that tomorrow would answer the small questions with small answers. I told myself that neap days reward patience and that maps only stretch when a hand pulls them. The truth of both statements sat beside a quieter truth I did not write. Sometimes the hand is not yours. Dawn came with the same softened light and the same neap hush, as if the atoll had pressed 2 fingers to its own pulse. I launched alone again, carrying the portable tide staff like a flag I did not want to wave. The plan was dull on purpose. Set the spare face on the lagoon side, run checks against the reef-flat staff, drift with the multibeam asleep, then repeat the strange lines only after the water had told me its business. I wrote that into the deck log in the plainest slate, then powered the array off and left it that way. Sometimes you learn more by keeping quiet than by asking too much. At the lagoon edge, I worked the portable staff into a sandy niche behind a patch of turtle grass, far from prop wash and the little tug that wakes when boats come and go. I marked its 0 against a paint nick and stepped back until the glare softened. The reef-flat staff across the crust of coral stood where it always had, white face bright. Through the binoculars, I could read both, switching my focus as if I were watching 2 clocks in different rooms. They should have nodded together, each rising and falling by a small, shared thought. They did not. The lagoon face stalled for a breath when the reef-flat face kept its tiny climb. Then the lagoon stepped forward while the reef-flat hesitated as if considering politeness. It was not much. It was enough to make a worker of tides feel watched. I took the drogue and split the risk by dropping a second canvas off the stern with a separate line, letting both mouths find their hold. One rode soft toward the pass, the other flirted with a pull toward the outer lip as if a strand of water were slipping past beneath our keel. I wrote it down, pen steady, body not. The engine idled only to keep the bow honest, multibeam still dark, chart plotter on with the base chart held to its sober palette. The track of our drift drew a line that should have looked like a slow thought leaning one way. It hiccuped. A small loop formed where no hand had turned the wheel. I put my fingers on the rim to be sure. The wheel had not moved. A thin sweetness worked under the diesel, the kind of smell that rides cut kelp when it warms and sighs. I looked for the source and found only the common signs of a slow day: fish dimpling in the shade of the launch, a cloud of little fry flicking at the drogue line. I listened for the half voice and heard instead the kind of hush that boats make when they surrender to water's grammar. On the reef-flat, a private flag buoy leaned toward the pass and then, with the insolence of a cat, turned its back to it. I made myself write only what I could prove. Lagoon staff, brief lag against reef face, twin drogues reporting divergent set, track shows a soft loop without helm input. I kept the words short to starve the story. When the multibeam finally came alive, it did so grudgingly, as if a polite room had received an uninvited guest. I brought us to the outer lip and ran a slow, narrow swath directly across the mute patch. Absence held its shape. The double whisper returned at the same edges as before, as faithful as a habit no one wants but forgets to break. I idled the array and drifted again, standing midships with one palm on the rail and the other on the logboard so the pencil would not chatter. The lagoon staff moved as if the world were breathing through cotton. The reef-flat face answered with clean, small steps. Their difference was now a visible beat rather than a suspicion. I wrote, faces out of phase by a small beat, differences swapped order without weather or wind to sponsor them. I called the mothership and kept my voice too calm. I asked for permission to check the research mooring at slack, use a mask only, no fins, no tools, just eyes. The answer came with a pause that felt like a man pinching his nose while thinking. Granted, but mind the rules and take the line. I acknowledged and set the plan for later, then turned to a pass near the private markers to map across with the array half open. The whispers pricked the tails again near the floats that had shifted yesterday, but the mooring can itself stayed sulky and still. The chart base flexed under the vessel icon in time with nothing I could measure. The breath I had seen before now felt like a reminder that I was not the only thing tracing shapes. The drogue closest to the pass tugged toward open water with enough insistence that the line hummed a little. The other drogue lazed as a child does when asked to stand. I hauled the first aboard and dropped it again farther astern, measuring not with numbers, but with attention. It found the same unseen hand and leaned away. It is a small cost to admit confusion on the record. It is a larger cost to pretend it is not there. I told the log what I didn't like. Flow in layers with set in disagreement, staff faces speaking different tongues, base chart performing soft shifts when echoes wear the doubled breath. By the time the sun stood high enough to bleach color from the small world of the launch, I nosed to the mooring can. I tied the safety line around my waist and signaled the mothership with a short call. Mask on, knife left in the bag on purpose. I slid over the gunnel and let the water take the weight of me. Near the surface, sound turns to a hollow tin that makes engines everywhere. I dove shallow along the chain, eyes on link and shackle, hands behind my back to keep from touching what I had promised not to touch. The chain wore the marks of old rub and new polish. Fresh, bright arcs glowed on a few links where metal had kissed something hard this very morning. The concrete block below sat solid with its skirt silted. No fresh tumble, no roll. The chain, though, showed a pattern of clean on one side and old on the other, as if it had been walked around by a slow dancer who could not quite finish the turn. I surfaced and leaned elbows on the can, catching breath and listening to the way the world sounds when your ears still wear water. From that odd, cupped place, I heard the half-voice again. Not language, not engine, not wind. A measured hush that matched the beat I had watched between the two staff faces. I kept still until it faded. Back aboard, I dried my hands and wrote without ornament. Mooring chain exhibits fresh polish arcs inconsistent with recorded sea state. Block seated. Audible motif present at surface consistent with prior soft breath. Will avoid names. I did not say voice. Names carve grooves. I ran the array only for a single line back toward the lagoon. Swath narrowed, gained shy, as if tiptoeing might keep the water from playing coy. Near the threshold where the lagoon turns greener, the delayed tails chose to stack, two soft echoes close together after a few of the pings, and then they stopped. At that instant, the base chart under the icon smoothed, as if someone had smudged the fabric flat. The portable staff on the lagoon side took that moment to leap a paint width upward, an impolite little jump. The reef-flat face did not join it until a breath later, like a companion who has decided to pretend they were always walking in step. I stood with one palm spread on the console and counted to calm myself, not in numbers, just by the old method sailors use when storm and work make fools of arithmetic. A local skiff slid by at distance, the helmsman lifting his chin in the small salute of water people. Behind it, the wake climbed and then fell, and in the place where it should have been a simple welt on the lagoon, the surface seemed to take the wake and lay it down backward for a heartbeat. I could not prove it. I wrote nothing of that and felt a private shame about my caution. I did mark that the private flags near that track stood indecisive for a long moment after the skiff had passed, then remembered their obligations and leaned toward the pass again. By late day, I had what every office likes least, a pattern described in careful words, shaped by small costs to patience, and owed an answer tomorrow. I returned the portable staff to its locker because leaving two faces out overnight has a way of inviting arguments you cannot attend. On the way to the mothership, I scrolled through my tracks and found the pale reach near the outer lip again, the one that fades and returns like a shy hint. I tried to coax the software into confessing a buffer sin. It told me it was clean and nearly scolded me for asking. At the gangway, the air smelled like warm rope and tea. I gave a report trimmed of drama but full of detail, asked for permission to repeat the two-staff check at first light, and suggested a long drift with all ears shut while the sun climbed. The approval came with a request in return. Send a brief to the research crew about the mooring, ask if they had noticed any mischief, keep the tone collegial and dull. I agreed. Later, when the launch was quiet and the reef ring turned pink under a haze, I wrote the note with the steadiness of someone laying out screws from a machine they will have to put back together blind. Before the light went, I looked once more at the tide staff on the reef-flat through the binoculars. It wore its numbers like calm advice. I lowered the glass and saw the same face with my bare eyes. For the wag of a heartbeat, the marks felt farther apart than they had been. Then, they were what they always were. I told myself I was tired, and tomorrow would bring the small answers. I also told myself that water remembers shapes we draw through it, and sometimes it decides to redraw them, not to spite us, but to remind us the chart is an argument, not a verdict. I set out before the galley clatter again, carrying more patience than coffee and the portable staff tucked in the stern. The mothership's voice on the radio came in low and clean, granting the drift plan and asking for a midday check-in that sounded like a request and a thread. I answered with the flat confidence that keeps colleagues from worrying, then shut the array down on purpose and let the launch idle at the pass mouth until water decided what to do with us. The drogue went over and took its small bite. I added the second canvas a few breaths later and watched them choose different loyalties. One leaned for the lagoon, the other insisted on the outer lip as if the reef were exhaling beneath it. I wrote the observation as plain as rope. Layered set persists. Drogues disagree without wind to sponsor quarrel. I brought us to a transit I had built yesterday out of headland and a crooked palm on the far quay. The line should carry a launch straight across the inner bar with the composure of an old tune. I let go the wheel to the friction knob and watched the world. The icon on the plotter drifted a finger's width off the transit, while my naked eyes swore that palm and headland held me true. I kept my hands away to avoid lying to myself. The base chart made a soft fold under the icon, smoothing itself after it had strayed, and my wake on screen rehearsed a brief curve I could not see in the water. I felt the helm beneath my palm without taking it, a faint tremor unrelated to engine or chop, more like a man shifting his stance on a wooden floor. I wrote the feeling down in words that made it sound like a measurement so I could live with them later. I powered the array and returned to the outer lip because ignoring the mute bite felt like turning your back on a cough. The swath came up calm, and for a few heartbeats the world played by rules. Then the double whisper began to nibble the ends of traces. The clean absence reappeared as if someone had lifted a tile and forgotten to put it back, and the plotter performed its new party trick. A short reach of the track behind me paled, sharpened, and then thinned to ghost. Not all of it, a small span only, as if the launch had hesitated to admit its own past. I toggled the display, zoomed, panned, and the line returned with the embarrassment of a person who has been caught pretending not to know you. I told the log what I saw and underlined nothing. I aimed for a private marker I had measured against the coral boulders and held the boat slow enough to quiet restless thoughts. The float wore a fresh scrape again, pale against weathered fiber, as if it had kissed rock and then pulled away with regret. A second float set crosswise to the set and then corrected itself by degrees, just as a stubborn animal concedes to a firm hand when no one is watching. I called the mothership and made the maintenance report I had promised the researchers. The reply came as clipped politeness with thanks and no appetite for stories. They had not moved the gear. They would like me to leave all as found. I said of course and meant it. My own small plan hardened behind the voice I used on the radio. The day's test was a long, idle drift over the mute patch with the multibeam asleep, and every instrument that could be shut quieted, leaving only the plotter awake to draw line on memory. I took bearings by eye on the same stubborn transit and set both drogues to work, one longer than the other, to feel separate breaths. The launch settled into a soft dance that should have laid a straightforward thread on the screen. The track drew true for a while. Then a loop appeared, small and neat, as if my boat had walked around a knot in the air and resumed its path. My hands had not moved, the wheel had not twitched. I opened the storage bin where the field chart lay under a plastic sleeve and put a pencil dot on paper where the loop showed on screen, a polite double check from the century of graphite. The dot looked lonely on that clean sheet. When I looked back up, the loop on the screen was gone, and the line had straightened itself like a hair smoothed by a hand. I glanced down. The pencil dot had smeared without contact and left a shadow where a circle might have been if I had been brave enough to draw it. I kept the drift going and spoke a few fragments into the log, embedding them as sentences to keep the page from turning into an omen. Drift steady by eye, track briefly self-revises, pencil mark smudge without touch. Diesel smell sat low and warm. Under it a sweetness rose that had no business rising at this hour, that kelp sigh I could not stop noticing. I let the engine stay at its low murmur and felt the console under my palm, the faint irregularity that had no vibration to accompany it. The water at the bow wore a skin like silk tugged from below by careful fingers. I powered the array again and pointed the swath through the mute patch, then offset the fan by the smallest polite step to avoid arguing with yesterday's views. The absence held its shape as if pleased to be recognized. The delayed tails stacked again on a few returns and then lost interest. When they did, the base chart under the icon performed the reverse of a sigh and laid itself smooth. I changed only the boat's speed by a whisper and watched the delays choose new partners among the pings while the chart below behaved like fabric being ironed slowly by a patient hand. I logged it with the dry courtesy of a lab note and kept anger out of the words. Halfway through the pass, a local boat passed astern at distance, its helmsman lifting 2 fingers in the old salute. The wake should have nudged my bow one way. It did, a little. The drogues answered like workers asked to move a crate across a floor, one shouldering, one trailing. On the screen, my track wavered and then straightened itself in a way that was too neat for nature. I thought of buffer settings and redraw delays and reminded myself that software loves to look competent. I saved the data the way a cautious person lays aside a witness's phone number even when they do not plan to call. Near midday, the mothership asked for the check-in I had promised. I kept the voice level and made it about fuel and lunch and the small victories of patience. The reply held a pause that carried more care than words admit. A request followed, mild but edged. Consider standing down for the afternoon before habit turns to fixation. I said yes and added that I would run a single quiet line along the inside of the pass to check for shifting sand tongues, the kind of maintenance that never offends in office. Permission granted, and a tone like a hand on a shoulder. I put the bow inside and let the swath run narrow along the inner face. The whisper in the tails left me alone, and for a few minutes I felt forgiven. Then the plotter performed something new and unmistakable. A reach from the morning simply disappeared, not paled, not thinned, not smoothed, gone. The window that shows the breadcrumb of our day offered a clean gap where a line had been. I didn't touch anything. I watched as the surrounding track tightened to hide the hole, the way sand closes in after a foot is lifted. I checked the raw file list and the machine told me with the calm of a bureaucrat that all was present. I looked down at the paper chart in its sleeve. The pencil dot from the loop had bled into a gray oval that looked older than it should have, the way a stain pretends to be part of the paper. I anchored near the reef-flat staff to cool my thoughts and walked the portable face back to its niche in the lagoon. I told myself I would remove it before dusk, and then chose not to. I wanted both eyes open through the evening rise and fall. It is a small cost to leave a thing out after promising yourself you would not. I called the mothership and admitted the change with the kind of voice that frames a deviation as a courtesy. The reply accepted it and asked me to sleep on the ship rather than on the launch. I agreed. The water around the staff wore the smallest of cat's paws, though wind had lost interest. The reef smell was bright and salt clean. The half voice that has kept me honest these past days returned for a single measured breath and then withdrew, like a patient teacher closing a book. On the ride back, I scrolled through the day's path as if it were a confession. Short spans continued to thin and then restore, while one reach inside the pass stayed missing as if it had never happened. I held the screen edge to steady my hand and saw, in the faint mirror, my face with the reef ring and the staff behind me like an index mark on my own skin. I closed the unit, opened it again, and the gap persisted. I do not pray to machines, but I did wait in silence for a moment before powering the plotter down. Back aboard the mothership, I gave the report in the language that keeps rooms calm. I spoke about maintenance, about cross-checks, about a wish to lift the mooring chain tomorrow under supervision and verify that its polish arcs tell no larger story. I didn't say trackline lost. I said data presentation inconsistent. The difference is sometimes the price of being allowed to keep working. After the meeting, I returned to the launch alone to coil cables and lay out the morning in my head. In the tray, the deck log had taken on a faint salt damp, as if a wet sleeve had touched it. I had not worn one. The pencil marks read a shade lighter than when I set them down. I pressed my finger to the page and felt only paper, dry and patient. The sun dropped behind a haze that made the reef ring glow as if viewed through old glass. I stood at the gunwale and watched the portable staff in the lagoon and the fixed face on the reef-flat nod to one another across the glare, out of phase by that small, stubborn beat. I thought of charts as promises, of promises as lines we draw on water and ask it to remember. The sea remembers in its own grammar. Today it had begun to edit my sentences. I went out with the light still thin and salt still cool on the rail, a stiffness in my shoulders I blamed on sleep but knew belonged to the work. The mothership's voice came soft on the radio, permission to proceed with the day's tests and a gentle request to keep within the atoll until afternoon. The tone carried worry wrapped in procedure. I answered with the steadiness that makes worry back down. Today was for proof, not poetry. I laid the portable staff back in its lagoon niche, glassed the fixed face on the reef flat, and watched their small nod out of step settle into its old, stubborn rhythm. Drogues over, one found the pass as if it were a habit, the other leaned for the outer lip with patient insistence. The launch breathed with the neap, that soft rise and settle that lulls people into mistakes. I opened the deck log and wrote the plan in a hand that would convince a future stranger I had meant to be careful. I began with dead reckoning, the oldest friend, to strip glamour from screens. I set a transit between headland notch and that crooked palm, counted off distance by feel and habit, and drew a grease pencil thread on a clear overlay clipped to the console. The plotter showed its own line in the patient blue it prefers. The two should have shadowed one another like companions who know each other's footsteps. They did not. My pencil thread eased along the overlay. The plotter line ran true, then paled, then thickened as if a nervous scribe had gone back to darken letters. I kept my eyes on the world instead of the screen, and felt the helm speak that tiny floor shift I have come to resent, a weight passed from one foot to the other in a room that planned to stay still. I added to the log a sentence without drama: overlay and electronic track diverge by a shade, helm sensation irregular without engine cause, repeat on reciprocal. I shut the array and drifted with both drogues set. The track the plotter painted should have become a gentle scythe through still water. A loop stitched itself into the path and then straightened, the kind of correction that happens when a hand erases a word and writes it again with more confidence. My grease pencil line on the overlay did not follow. It showed the loop plainly, a neat ear drawn by a child. I let my palm hover above the plastic. No smear came from me. Minutes later, the ear on the overlay softened, the graphite turning from crisp to dusk as if a warm breath had passed over it. I pressed a fingertip to test for damp and found only dry. I wrote in the log that overlay marks appeared to soften without contact, that the track on the screen revised itself while helm and wake denied revision. Words that look foolish later are easier to defend when they are plain. I brought the multibeam online and ran a slow kiss across the outer lip where the mute bite had held its ground. Absence met me like a colleague who has learned my schedule. I altered fan angle by the smallest courtesy and gave the system time to listen harder. The double whisper tagged a few tails, faithful to place rather than beam. I leaned on the console and felt that almost voice in my bones again. Not sound so much as intention passing through wood and glove. I laid a small note into the log that named nothing. Motif present near outer lip, concurrent with tail doubling and base flex, water otherwise courteous. A radio call from the research crew came in polite and guarded. They thanked me for the mooring report and said they might send a diver next week to look at chain and block. Their tone asked me to leave everything as found and to avoid the can except in clear calm. I said yes and avoided telling them the calm itself had become the problem. I steered close enough to watch the can's cap with the eye of a carpenter checking a level. It sat like a pupil in a steady iris, then hiccuped to turn and steadied again with the guiltless composure of a child who has put a cup back on the wrong shelf and decided to believe the shelf had moved. The small stakes began to step out from behind the curtain. Inside the pass, a sand tongue that had worn a certain polite shape since I arrived showed a fresh lip beginning to lean where no tide that week should bully it. If a thread of track vanished on a day when someone had to find their way home in haze, a boat could put its belly where coral waits with old teeth. I called the mothership and asked permission to lay a temporary paper trail of ranges and bearings along the inside lane, a belt and suspenders answer from the century that loves paper. Granted, but with a note that sounded like a hand on my shoulder again. I thanked the voice and took the permission as both help and warning. I made my ranges with the kind of care that slows breath. Palm, notch, distant boulder, a low tower, the way a white sand cut meets mangrove shadow. I set each in the mind and then gave it a line of words in the log. I drew them on the overlay in crisp grease strokes and wrote instructions as if to a tired stranger who would not trust the plotter when it blinked. In the corner of the overlay, the earlier pencil ear turned paler still, backgrounding itself like a bruise fading out of a photograph. The plotter's breadcrumb behind my stern did its party trick again, a short section thinning and then reasserting itself with prim confidence. I took a photograph of the screen and of the overlay together, knowing full well that a camera can be a liar's ally and a witness's enemy. But sometimes you lay down too many checks and the lie must tire of leaping them. At midday, the neap breathed a little more than the past days, as if the atoll had remembered an obligation. The drogues answered with less disagreement, then resumed their quiet quarrel. I rode a long idle drift across the mute patch with the array sleeping to ease the noise in my own head. Without the fan's heartbeat, the boat felt unpinned. I heard the half voice again, not from any direction exactly, more a paced hush inside the timbers, matching the beat between the two staff faces without asking permission. I looked through glass at the reef-flat face and then through glass at the lagoon face. They were out of phase by the same small, maddening sliver. Then they were not. Then they were again, like two people trying to walk together without admitting they never learned how. I powered up for a single transect across the inner lane where that sand lip had leaned. The swath traced the curve in clean, workmanlike color. The double whisper kept to itself as if bored with the shallow talk. Then the plotter committed a new discourtesy. The morning's careful thread along the inside line dimmed, then went absent, leaving behind a spotless reach of base as if nothing had ever tested that water. My overlay showed the line and my hand's work, black and present. I set the wheel, reached for the deck log, and wrote the sentence I'd been trying not to write. Track line lost on instrument while parallel manual record persists. File directory claims completeness. Recommend immediate backup to external medium and paper ranges for passage until conclusion. I added a second sentence I wished I could swallow. Risk to navigation within pass if electronic breadcrumb cannot be trusted under haze or night. Advise hand ranges and companion boat for retrieval until we settle the argument. I called the mothership and let the worry in their earlier tone climb into mine. I described the loss as a display fault, then corrected myself and called it a record fault that mimicked display. The silence that followed was long enough to carry imagined faces. Approval came for a return to ship and for redundancies, a cautious captain loves, paper trail, second vessel on standby during any narrow work, no solo transits after dusk. I said yes. I didn't say that the dusk inside my chest had already fallen. On the way back, I stopped at the portable staff to retrieve it, then left it standing because some part of me wanted one more pair of eyes on the evening. I set both drogues on short lines so they would not tangle and told the water to make its case. The launch turned with the smallest of spins and then steadied. On the screen, the spin did not appear. On the overlay, my pencil made a quiet curl almost without deciding to. I raised the plastic to the light. The new mark held. The old marks wavered. In the deck log, the page edges had taken on a salt curl I could not blame on spray. I closed the board and pressed the cover with the heel of my hand as if sealing a letter I could not bear to mail. At the gangway, the reef laid out its late color, bright and tired at once. I gave the report in the calm language that gets extra hands without raising voices. We agreed on a shutdown of optional work until morning and on a quiet lift of the mooring chain under supervision if weather kept faith. As I stepped off the launch, I looked back at the plotter and saw the day's path redraw itself into a cleaner, kinder story than the one I had lived. Gaps closed, loops straightened, the breadcrumb made a sentence it preferred. I stood with one foot on deck and one on the dock and smelled diesel and rope and that thin sweetness that did not ride from any bottle. The sea wore a surface that promised everything and admitted nothing. In my pocket, the grease pencil had warmed and left a gray taste on my fingers when I touched the tip. On the overlay, the line I had made along the inside lane still stood, stubborn and dull. The staff faces nodded across the glare, out of step and then together, undecided about their friendship. I told myself I would sleep and that morning would let the world rehearse itself back into one version. I also told myself that maps do not erase themselves. Something must do the erasing. The neap held its soft hand over the atoll as if to comfort it. And beneath that comfort, I felt the restraint that comes before a word spoken in a quiet room. A word you cannot take back. I took the launch at gray light with the kind of steadiness that keeps equipment brave. The mothership had agreed to the mooring lift under supervision once the sun rose high enough for easy eyes, and until then I meant to give the water one more chance to tell me its grammar. I set the portable staff in its lagoon niche without ceremony, glassed the reef-flat face, and accepted their same small quarrel. Drogues over. One leaned toward the pass, the other for the outer lip, as if the lagoon and the reef were breathing from different lungs. I opened the deck log and wrote a plan that would read like common sense to anyone who thought ghosts belonged to books. Drift with all ears shut, lay a grease thread across the pass, back up files twice, then take a careful look at the chain. I silenced the multibeam, dimmed the plotter to its sober palette, and let the drogue pair decide the first sentence of our drift. Diesel smell sat low and warm. Under it, a clean mineral rose that belongs to rain far away, though the sky held its breath. The track should have written a gentle scythe. It drew that shape, then rehearsed a neat ear without asking me, then smoothed itself as if a hand had pressed the page. On the overlay, my grease line marked the ear plainly. I kept my palm off the plastic and watched the graphite soften a shade, as if the mark were being rubbed from the other side. I added a sentence to the log with a carpenter's restraint. Manual overlay shows curl the instrument later denies. Helm steady. Drogues disagree in polite argument. I powered the array for a single pass over the outer lip. The mute patch greeted me with the composure of an old neighbor who knows you will come by whether invited or not. The delayed tails chose a few pings and made their double whisper there, loyal to place rather than setting. I turned the fan a hair, and the whisper stayed true to water, not to beam. The base chart under the vessel icon performed its small fold, a smoothing and relaxing that matched no swell and no wind. I wrote it cleanly, then shut the fan again to spare my own head the heartbeat. At mid-morning, the research crew crackled on the radio with a time and a tone. Proceed to the can when ready. Keep it gentle. No tools beyond the eyes and the line. We are watching. I answered with the voice field hands use when they want permission to remain honest. I set a transit by headland notch and crooked palm and went slow enough to hear my thoughts rearrange. As I came abeam of the mooring, the can pivoted a polite angle, then decided against dramatics and settled. The chain below flashed bright on a few links where metal had kissed coral this morning rather than last week. The block sat proper, skirt silted, truth heavy. The polish told a story of movement without drift, a circle walked without a partner. I clipped the safety line and slid over the side while the mothership kept me on a short leash of words. Water closed with that tin room hush. I dove to the chain, hands tucked back to honor the rule. On one link, a new arc showed, clean as a fresh planed board. The link next to it were the dull of time. Between them, a hairline of scuff shown in a pattern I know from cables that have been invited to step around a corner one step at a time and then return to their pride. I rose and let my elbows rest on the can and listened. The half-voice came through the metal into my bones, not language, not engine, something paced. I kept still until it passed. On deck, I wrote the sentence I could defend. Fresh polish arcs on chain inconsistent with observed sea state. Block seated, audible motif present by touch through metal. Continue under rule. We lifted gently. The chain came up link by link, the kind of work that makes a boat into a hard lesson if you hurry. No snags, no twist. The block stayed where it belonged. On the plotter, as if insulted by our care, a short reach of the morning's track behind the launch thinned and then went absent, leaving base where breadcrumb had been. The research lead's voice asked for status. I said calm things about load and line. In the deck log, I wrote the other truth. Trackline failing in sight of witness. Instrument insists on file completeness. Recommend redundancy as practice rather than preference. We lowered the chain and let it settle. The can turned once and held. I drifted a few breaths longer with ears shut, then opened the array for a stingy swath along the inner lane where sand had leaned. The double whisper kept its distance. The base laid smooth. I told myself that work was work, and superstition had no place in a craft where wrecks happen to fools who write stories into data. Then the radio gave my own voice back to me, not in echo, not in feedback, but with the pause mislaid and my last word held too long, a mirror with one wrong angle. I touched the handset and heard only C. I logged nothing of that because a page that admits imitation finds a way to invite it. I backed up the day's files to an external stick, then to a second, then checked them against the directory that swore they matched. On reopening, one showed a pale reach in the pass where the other showed a line. I took a photograph of both, like a man preparing to testify to the shape of a shadow. The overlay on the console, my grease thread across the pass, had taken on a dusted look at the edges as if the sea's breath had settled on it and decided to stay. I wiped it with a clean cloth, and the smudge did not brighten. The pencil felt softer in my fingers, the graphite willing to mark and unwilling to stand. The tide faces did their small theater. Lagoon and reef-flat nodded out of step, then together, then apart again like partners who cannot decide which foot leads. On a whim, I stood the portable staff a pace farther back into turtle grass and watched. For a single beat, both faces agreed more than they had any right to, then resumed their quarrel with a kind of relief. I wrote that with care. Brief concord between faces on reposition, no wind shift, no swell change, holds only for a breath. Inside the pass, the private marker that had scraped fresh earlier leaned toward the lagoon with the air of a dog nosing a door. The float wore a new pale stripe half a hand long. I didn't touch it. I spoke into the logboard instead, one of those documentary sentences that sounds like a prayer because it insists on small things. Float orientation inconsistent, tether wear progressing. Contact owner with courtesy once we have a map we can trust. By late day, the work had narrowed to the kind that makes a person choose between obedience and the itch to know. Orders favored a stand down before evening. Field reality wanted one last cross of the mute patch with the fan barely awake. a pinhole of listening to see whether the double whisper would keep faith. I split the difference. I idled across with the array in standby, and the plotter set to record without announcing it with noise. The water wore a surface like silk drawn between careful fingers. Somewhere in the timbers, the paced hush returned and set its count to the beat between the two staffs. On the screen, a short loop appeared at the edge of the mute patch, then straightened. On the overlay, the grease made its own curl that lasted longer than it had any right to, and then softened as if the plastic had learned to forget. I shut everything down in the reverse order that keeps gremlins from taking heart. Diesel fell to silence. The launch took the neap in small knees. In the reflection on the black plotter screen, I saw the reef ring behind me and the portable staff standing like a witness with no taste for speeches. I reached for the deck log and found the last page damp at the edges, though my hands were dry. The words I had written in the morning read a shade lighter than the ones I had written after lunch. I pressed the page flat, and the letters refused to darken, as if the day preferred to edit itself in favor of calm. On the way back, the mothership asked for a summary. I gave one that would not frighten a cautious captain. Layered set, minor instrument inconsistencies, mooring inspected, recommend paper ranges until resolved. I did not say the sea had begun to erase my certainties while leaving enough of each to make me complicit. The approval came with the usual hand on the shoulder and a request I had not expected. Take tomorrow to rest while we decide whether to keep the contract for one more week. I said I would rest and heard my own voice like a man promising to eat after he has counted the spoons. At the gangway, I paused with one foot on the launch and one on the ship. The reef wore evening, all gentleness. The staffs nodded their small argument across the glare. The can sat like a pupil that had learned discretion. In my pocket, the grease pencil had warmed. On the overlay, the line along the inside lane still stood, stubborn and dull, a trace that a sea would have to work to soften. I told myself that tomorrow I would draw nothing and ask only with quiet eyes. I also told myself that lines resist until they don't, and that sometimes a chart's cleanest truth is the empty place where a track should be. The sea held the same gentle hand over the atoll, but the work had changed inside me. I went out after dawn with the launch trimmed light, the array sleeping, and the deck log open to a new page that smelled faintly of salt, as if the paper had learned the weather. The mothership had granted me a day to rest, and then, after a pause that sounded like the shifting of an unseen weight, permitted a final round of checks before decisions were made. I took that as both grace and limit. Portable staff in the lagoon niche, reef-flat face glassed from the helm. Their small quarrel continued with the stubborn affection of relatives who cannot agree about the hour. I let the drogues choose loyalties. One found the pass like a habit. The other leaned seaward as if the reef itself were breathing out through it. I wrote only what a stranger could verify and set aside the urge to tidy the strangeness with a story. I began with silence. Multibeam off, plotter dimmed, engine barely nudging. I let the launch settle into a drift that should have written a slow curve across memory. The screen showed that shape for a span, then rehearsed a neat ear and, with the prim certainty of a clerk, smoothed the kink until the line looked blameless. On the overlay, the grease held the curl, honest and plain, then softened at the edges as if a warm breath had passed too close. I touched nothing. I told the log that manual and electronic were describing 2 neighboring days. Diesel lay low under a clean mineral that belongs to rain elsewhere. The paced hush I had come to know as a motif returned inside the timbers, not sound so much as intention, counting itself in the small beat between the 2 staff faces. I woke the array and walked us to the outer lip as if to a conversation that had refused to end. The mute patch waited like a colleague who has moved a chair half an inch to see if you will notice. The delayed tails made their double whisper at the same edges, loyal to place rather than beam or speed. I eased the fan a hair and tried a slower pass, then a quicker one, deciding to owe the system a fairness that would read well on a bad day. Absence held. The base chart under the icon performed its soft fold and smoothing, matching no wind, no swell, nothing but the rhythm of that unowned count the staffs had taught me to hear. I wrote it in the clean language of craft. I had asked quietly for a thought from a coastal scientist ashore, a friend who trusts the sea to write first drafts and humans to compose later. The reply came in a short burst last night, spare and kind. A lagoon can hold a lens of fresher water after distant rain, and under a weak tide and long calm, That lens can slide and breathe against the heavier brine beneath. A bar of temperature can ride above a slope and bend sound the way heat bends a mirage. A reef can set up a slow, standing siege that walks pressure from one room to the next. Microbubbles from spawning can live longer than pride admits and turn honest echoes coy. None of that explains a pencil smudge, my friend wrote, but any of it could make a machine forget itself for a breath. Partial, not salvation. I copied the essence into the deck log without the comfort of conclusion and let the words cool there like tools laid down between tasks. With that small permission to be almost satisfied, I set a program of plain tests. I strung a line of ranges along the inner lane, each tied to a headland notch, a crooked palm, a clouded boulder, a dull tower at the horizon's shoulder. I drew them on the overlay in unromantic strokes, then ran the boat by dead reckoning across the pass while the plotter spawned its breadcrumb and the array, still sleeping, refused to be a scapegoat. The range crossings fell where they should by eye and by grease. On the screen, a short span thinned, paled, and returned with modesty. I wrote that the world and the memory of the world had shaken hands, then argued, then shrugged. I took a last look at the research mooring. The can wore its composure carefully, like a uniform pressed too often. I slid into the water on a short safety line, the radio chattering approval in small syllables, and drifted down the chain with my hands folded behind my back. New arcs of bright polish marked links in a pattern of almost circles, as if a patient dancer had stepped around the same question again and again and stopped before naming it. The block sat true, no fresh tumble. When I floated up and wedged my elbows on the can, the metal gave me back the paced hush through bone. I listened and let it pass. On deck, I wrote a sentence that did not invite a fight. Evidence favors small cyclic motions in calm water. Driver unknown. Risk to instrument confidence elevated. Recommend conservative passage until pattern ceases or cause accepted. Near midday, the reef-flat staff and the lagoon face gave me a gift they had withheld. For the length of a single slow breath, they nodded together. Then they resumed their old quarrel, relieved to be themselves again. I moved the portable staff a pace deeper into the turtle grass and watched the Concorde return for a heartbeat, then fail. I could live with that. A sliding lens wants an eddy to settle against. A seiche wants a room to lean into. I wrote it down, not as truth, but as a map of a path my mind could walk without falling. The double whisper dwindled when I kept the boat in the higher green water and strengthened near the clear blue slope, which is how sound behaves when the reef keeps a secret it does not mean to keep. I made a small note that would age well in another hand. The base chart, offended by my contentment, took one last opportunity to misbehave. A morning reach inside the pass blinked out and reappeared, then resolved into a cleaner line than I had lived. I opened the raw list, read its stubborn assertion of completeness, and closed it like a drawer. I traced the path on paper with a thin patience, then went and ran it again at slow speed. The overlay and the water agreed. The screen was a neighbor, not a spouse. Back at the pass mouth, I set both drogues short, then long, then crosswise, and watched them argue in a way I could now almost predict. The launch breathed with the neap, and the engine's small comfort let my thoughts drop anchor. I opened the deck log to the first page of this work and read my early hand, the cheerful script of a person who believed that careful attention always moves the world toward clarity. My later notes had thinned, the words choosing quiet over drama. Between those hands, the pencil's gray had drifted not toward smudge, but toward a tone that looked like distance. I closed the board and held it a moment as one holds a book at the last chapter, reluctant to finish, willing to accept the cost of an ending that leaves a door ajar. I powered down the array in the order that mollifies gremlins and brought the launch to the reef-flat staff for a final check before turning home. The face read steady. The lagoon partner lagged and then caught up, the way two walkers adjust without apology. Private markers in the inner lane had worn fresh, pale stripes that would write their own maintenance letters. The mooring can held its decorum. On the screen, the day's breadcrumb made a respectable sentence. On the overlay, the grease line along the safe lane looked dull and stubborn, the sort of mark a storm cannot quite bully off a chart table. I lifted the plastic and let the light shine through. The old curls and ears were almost gone, as if time had learned to treat them as rumor. I called the mothership and gave my last report in the language that earns trust. Instruments had misbehaved in ways consistent with layered water and small standing motions. Partial explanation available. Risk to navigation reduced by ranges and paper. Recommend leaving paper aids in place until a spring turns the system honest or another team confirms. I spared them my private inventory, a paced hush through wood and bone, a chain that wrote small circles without wind, a plotter that preferred a cleaner story than the one my hands had drawn. Those belonged to my craft, not to the contract. The ride back laid the reef ring under a haze that made the world feel printed on old glass. I throttled down at the gangway and let the hull's tremor take a long breath. In the black of the plotter, I caught my reflection, and behind it, the portable staff like a witness tired of its duty. I shut the screen, and it showed me nothing at all, which is sometimes the kindness a machine can offer. I stowed the overlay and the grease pencil, wiped the deck log with a clean cloth, and left the faint salt curl as a signature of the place. The sea had edited my work and left enough of each page to tell me where to stand. As I stepped onto the ship, a small wake from a distant skiff rolled under the launch and set the drogues to nod as if agreeing to a truce. The staffs across the glare exchanged their little disagreement and then, for a breath, forgot it. I will carry that breath, lagoon and reef-flat in step, the hush in the timbers silent, the chart, paper, and screen aligned long enough to be believed. It did not last. It did not need to. Some answers live at the edge of patience, and some maps are true enough when the tide is modest and a hand remembers how to draw a straight line without asking a machine to approve.